Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to do a book haul revisit for the month of June. If you're unfamiliar, this is where I look back at book hauls that I have done in the month of June in the past and see how many of the books I have read, how many I have unhauled, and how many I would still like to read, and maybe think about what books might be unhauled in the future. My big watch out criteria for this, in an attempt to make myself a more intentional book purchaser and get to know myself as a reader and how likely I am to read books that I might spend money on, is the metric for books that I have unhauled without reading. And that is what I want to be careful of. We'll see how I do when we get to the end of the video. I will also include numbers for how many of the books that I brought into my library I ended up listening to on audio. I think it's an interesting statistic to track, but I myself don't necessarily care all that much if I end up listening to one of these on audio, probably because since I use Libby and platforms like that so much, I don't actually end up spending money on audiobooks very often, but your mileage may vary. Quick note before we begin, for the sake of timing, because I believe I have 6 years of book hauls to look at here. I have removed any books that were purchased for my Pulitzer Prize project, any books that were gifted to me, whether by a friend or loved one or a publisher. I have removed library builders, which are cases where I want to own all of the books that an author has published. I did this for Louise Erdrich, Sue Grafton, Toni Morrison, and so on. It's a very different purpose than purchasing a book with the intent to read it sometime soon. I have also removed any book that I had already read at the time it was purchased, because in that case, I knew I liked the book enough that I wanted a copy in my library. So again, it doesn't fit the same purpose. And I am only including books I purchased for myself with the intention or hope of reading that book sometime soon. We're going to start with the most recent book hauls. You can see I have a lot to get through. And that isn't even all of the books. Some of them have been unhauled. So we're going to start with the most recent book haul, which was, of course, June of 2024. And then we're going to go back in time to June of 2019. And then we will run through the statistics of how I did overall. So there were 3 books that met our criteria for this book haul revisit that came from June of 2024. And I should also note, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what these books are about. If you want that information, I will have links to the actual book hauls down below. You can follow that and get all of the information about the book that you would like. I also have affiliate links to all of these books if you are interested in purchasing any of them for yourself. Anyway, the first book from June of 2024 was The Barracks by John McGahern. So at this time last year, Joel and I had just come back from Ireland, and I read my first John McGahern book, which was Amongst Women, and I loved it. So I've been wanting to read more of his, and when I saw The Barracks pop up at my local used bookstore, I just had to grab it. I haven't read it yet, but I don't think I had intended to read it anytime really soon, and I would still like to read it. So it's not going anywhere. I haven't read it, but I would like to hold on to it until I do get around to reading it. Then there is Winter in the Blood by James Welch. I don't think I had any immediate plans to get to this book when I purchased it. I had been loosely thinking maybe sometime in the fall. Obviously, that did not end up happening because I have not read this book yet. I would still very much like to. It's a tiny little thing. It should be something that I would be able to fit in relatively easily. So hopefully soon I will be getting around to doing that. But in the meantime, it's not going anywhere. I still very much want to read this book. And that is an encouraging thing when I do these revisits, because sometimes the sense of urgency you might have to read a book has just kind of died. And those 2 books are things that I still very much want to get to. The final book from June of 2024 is The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Mary Ann Schaefer and Annie Barrows. I have not read this, and I admit this was something of a whim when I saw it at my local used bookstore and just grabbed it. I might have even gotten it from the library for $1. So it was an impulse purchase. I didn't have immediate plans to get to it, but people have consistently recommended this book to me since it was published. So someday I'll get around to it. I don't have any immediate plans to, but again, this is the way a book haul revisit should go. We have 3 books, and all 3, even though I have not read them, are things that I would still like to read. The urgency has not died down, and hopefully at some point I will get to all 3 of them, really. So, of the 3 books that I brought into my library in June of 2024, I've read 0, which is not great, but again, I do still want to read all of them. I have not unhauled any of the books, so that's also a 0, and I'm okay with that. I'm especially okay that since I didn't unhaul any books, I have not unhauled any books without reading them. And I have not listened to any of the books on audio because, again, I haven't read any. So let's move to June of 2023, which only has 2 books that meet our criteria for this video. The first one is This Other Eden by Paul Harding, and I debated with myself whether or not I should include this because Paul Harding is a Pulitzer Prize winner. But what I ultimately decided is that me purchasing this book didn't have anything to do with my Pulitzer Prize project, although I did eventually do a video about Paul Harding and his astonishing Pulitzer Prize victory for Tinkers. I will link that video down below if you would like to check it out. It's a wild story. So I decided to keep it in, but it's one of those weird gray areas because technically I could remove this, and there have been other cases where I have removed books, but I feel like, so for someone like Ann Tyler, because I think there was an Ann Tyler book that I did take out from this book, or one of these book hauls in the past, and I just think I'm doing a sort of project where I'm reading a bunch of Ann Tyler's books, especially the ones that she was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for, before I do my project on breathing lessons, because I think that sort of ramp up is important to her win, and that wasn't necessarily the case here. I'm really doing a lot of work to justify why I included this, and I should just tell you, I did read this book, and I liked it. I know it was a bit of a cilantro book. Some people liked it, some people hated it, but I did like it, and I continue to have it in my library. I don't think it's going to be going anywhere, at least not anytime soon. It can stay. I did enjoy it enough to hold on to it. The other book is something I have not read, and that is Greenland by David Santos Donaldson. I admit some of the urgency has gone out of this one, but I've had it consistently recommended to me because it does involve E.M. Forster. So there's a curiosity factor there. So I'm not going to get rid of it anytime soon. I would like to get around to reading it at some point, and we will see when, not if, but when I do eventually get around to reading it. So of those 2 books that I brought into my library in June of 2023, I've read 1. That's math that I can do. That's 50%. And that's not bad because when we get to the end, my goal is to have read at least 50% of the books that I've brought into my library. I feel like that's a good starting point. And 50% here is great. The 0 from June of 2024, not so great, but it is what it is. I'll take this 50%. I've not unhauled anything, so that's a 0. I've not unhauled anything without reading, obviously, and that is also a 0. And I did not listen to This Other Eden on audio, so I've not listened to any of the books I brought into my library on audio there. Now let's go back to June of 2022 and see how I do there. The first book is Out of Darkness by Ashley Hope Perez. I did a book box, like one of those curated book boxes from a bookstore in June of 2022. And the first 3 books that we're going to talk about came from that book box. There were 2 books in that book box that one that I had read before and one that I had purchased for myself at some point. So it was a duplicate. So I didn't include either of those, but this is the first one that actually qualified from that curated book box, and I have not read it yet. I admit I don't feel super compelled to read it, but I know this is a frequently banned book, so I feel like I should support it, and at some point I would like to get around to reading it. I don't have immediate plans to do it. This could be something that I end up in like 3 years not having read. If at that point I still haven't read it, which again feels likely, I might start to think about whether or not I need to unhaul it or pass it on in a little free library, since it is a frequently banned book. But that's for the future. For now, I'm going to hold on to it and see if I get around to reading it. Then there was Blackout, which is a collection of stories by various authors, including Angie Thomas. I did read that one and didn't really like it, so I got rid of it. I pretty immediately traded it in at my local used bookstore. So I read it. It's gone. I didn't feel a need to hold on to it. Then we have Aquarium, a novel by Yara Shahori. I have not read this yet, but I would still like it. And I'd say this one I feel a little more interested in reading than Out of Darkness. Why is sort of hard to explain. I don't really have a metric for it, although I think it involves hearing impaired characters, or at least one of them. And yes, it involves characters who are deaf. And maybe it's that makes me feel a little bit more drawn to this one. I haven't read it yet, but I feel like I have considered it. I don't feel like I have. So if you follow along, you know, I'm a mood reader. And a lot of the time, if I don't know what I want to read next, I will accumulate like a pile of books that I can choose from, usually anywhere from like 3 to 5. And this has been in the mix. It just hasn't been picked. And that's not a marker of me not being interested in the book. In fact, the purpose of, or the fact that it has been included in those piles, to me shows that I am really interested in reading this at some point. So hopefully I will get around to it soon. The final book I have to show you is The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honoré Fanon Jeffers. I did read this book and I absolutely loved it. It's a bit of a weird book to include in a book haul revisit. However, it does still qualify because when this book was in hardcover, I got it from, actually, I think I started out on audio and I wasn't really liking the audiobook narrator. So I decided to get on the hold list at my local library and I got the book, and this is a book that I really liked savoring. So I was taking my time getting through it, and it is a chunky book. So renewing the book and, you know, that process was not really working out from a library book. And by that point, the paperback release was on the horizon. So I just pre-ordered a copy of the paperback, and this is how I ultimately ended up reading it. So even though I had read roughly half of the book by that point, it still counts because I finished it with this one. So it still feels like it should be included here. I read it. I absolutely loved it. If you haven't read The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, do yourself a favor. This is a world that I could get lost in again, easily. And it, again, is a chunky book. So that's where the good news from June of 2022 pretty much stops because the next book is Notes of a Crocodile by Hu Mao Jin, translated by Bonnie Hui. This was something that I was supposed to read for the LGBTQ plus in translation read-along that I was co-hosting with Jen the Librarian. And I did not get to read it in the month we were supposed to read it, but the feedback was almost universally bad. So my interest in reading the book pretty much deflated to the point where I was like, why am I going to hold on to this? Because there's so many other books I would get to before I would get to this, given all of the negative stuff I've heard about the book. So I released it. So we're hitting my watch out criteria with this one and the next two. The next one being The Woman of Light, or just Woman of Light, ignore my calendar, by Callie Fajardo and Steen. I feel like this one could have been something that would have stayed, but once it was released, I really wanted to read it. What I really wanted to read was Fajardo Anstein's previous book, which is a collection of stories called Sabrina and Karina. And for some reason, about a year after this book was released, I had lost any sense of urgency to read it. And for that reason, ultimately, I decided to trade it in at my local used bookstore, but I could still easily be convinced to read it. So maybe at some point I would get it from the library or listen to it on audio, and then I could kind of cross it off my list. But so there's still a possibility that I would read it. I just didn't feel a need to hold on to a copy and wait, if that makes sense. The final book I actually did read, or attempt to read. It's Love and Other Disasters by Anita Kelly. I started this book, got a little ways into it, not very far, but I hated it. I really was not enjoying it, so I banished it from the house like a demon. That's a little strong. It wasn't that bad, but I just really wasn't enjoying it, so I didn't feel any need to keep reading it or to hold on to it. So it is gone, and I'm counting it as something that I read since I did have that experience of picking it up and just not enjoying it. So of the 7 books I brought into my library in June of 2022, I have read 3. That is 43% of this book haul, and that is Blackout, The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, and Love and Other Disasters, which again, I at least attempted to read. I've unhauled 3 books, and that is also, again, 43%. But only 2 of those were unhauled without reading. That's 29%. And again, that's my watch out criteria. I would like that number for the overall book hauls to be under 15% when we get to the end. So we'll see how I do. And I didn't listen to any of the books that I read on audio, even though I had kind of started listening to The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois on audio. I'm not counting it because when I had the book, I started at the beginning and read all the way through. So I'm counting that as something I read in print. Let's go to June of 2021. The first book that I brought into my library is Honeybee by Craig Silvey, which had been recommended to me by an author, actually, who is Australian. And I don't think this book is available in the United States. At least it wasn't when I ordered this from Australia. And there is some negative press about this book because it is about a transgender character, and from transgender people who have read this book or are familiar with it, it has been classified as sort of trauma porn. And that, I admit, has made me really hesitant to dive in and read this book. But part of me is still curious, especially since it was recommended to me by someone who has a transgender kid. So I'm holding on to it. There is a possibility that if I haven't read this in a year or 2, I might release it, but I feel like holding on to it for now and seeing what ultimately happens. If you've read Honeybee, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below, because I'm wondering. Then we have Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. I did read this book, and it was a difficult read because there's some heavy subject matter in this book. But I had to take a break, and that helped. I was able to ultimately finish the book. So this is a success story and a classic queer book if you're looking for something for Pride Month. This book is not available in stores. The way Leslie Feinberg wanted it to be is that they wanted this book to be available to anyone. So there's a PDF on Leslie Feinberg's website that you can just download of the book, or you can, the link I'll have down below is to a print shop that will sell you the book at cost. Like exactly the cost for printing the book is what it would cost you to get. So just in case you're interested, I would let you know that. So that is also a success story. Then we have Flames by Robbie Arnott. Now, I had read Robbie Arnott's The Rain Heron and absolutely loved it. So we wanted more Robbie Arnott because Joel loved The Rain Heron too. And this book at the time was not available in the United States. I don't think it still is. However, I did see a used copy pop up online from Powell's, so I ordered it. And Joel read it and was pretty mixed about it, which really killed my enthusiasm to read it, I admit. So I don't know when I will get around to reading this book, but I'm still curious to read more from Robbie Arnott. So at some point, I'm either going to need to pick one of his newer books to try instead, or just dive into this one. And I'm happy holding on to the book until I decide which course of action I would like to take. Then we have Bloom by Kevin Panetta and Savannah Ganichow. I did read this, and it was cute. I admit I have thought about trading this in at my local used bookstore because I don't know how likely I would be to read it again. And this is in a part of my library where I don't really have a lot of space. So I've thought about it. But allegedly there's a sequel coming. But the sequel has allegedly been coming for a couple of years at this point, and it has not materialized. So I don't know what's happening. So part of me wants to hold on to it in case the sequel does come out. But then I'm also thinking, since I was just kind of okay on the book, would I want to purchase a copy of the sequel or just get it from the library? And if that's the case, why am I holding on to this? So there is a possibility that I will not hold on to this forever, but I have read it and I did enjoy it. It's a cute book. So does it make sense? I don't know. But that's the way it is. So of the 4 books I brought into my library in June of 2021, I have read 2. Again, that's math I can do. 50%. That's a 50% success rate, which is where I want to be. So the ones I read were Stone Butch Blues and Bloom. I haven't unhauled any, so that's a 0. Of course, that means I haven't unhauled any without reading, and I haven't listened to any of them on audio, so that's another 0. Let's go back to June of 2020. The first book that I brought into my library then was The Lauras by Sara Taylor. I've not read this yet, but I would still be interested in reading it. It is something that had popped up now and then on my Pride Month pile of possibilities. It's not on my pile of possibilities for this year, but I want to hold on to it and see when I eventually get to it, because I will eventually get to it. That's the plan. Then there's The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. This one I have not read yet, but I would really like to. So my next James Baldwin book will either be The Fire Next Time or Another Country. I haven't really decided which yet. I'm kind of waiting for myself to be ready for another one of his books, because I've liked everything of his that I have read so far, including Go Tell It on the Mountain, which was his debut novel. And obviously it was part of my June 2020 book haul. And it's a success story because I read it and I enjoyed it. And it is now sitting on my shelves. Hang on. That didn't pile very well, so I just wanted to correct that. So that was a success story. And the next one, Forced Out, A Detective's Story of Prejudice and Resilience by Kevin Maxwell. I have read this. This one, I believe I ended up... No, I think I read the print. I think Joel listened to the audio and I read the print, if I'm remembering correctly. But I have read it. Great book. If you're looking for something for Pride Month, it is a story of him being forced out of the police for being gay. And a difficult book for the subject matter, but essential and a good book, I would say. Then there is The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. I did read this one. I ended up listening to it on audio. And I liked the book, so I held on to it for a long time. But ultimately, for whatever reason, I decided to trade it in, that I didn't need to hold on to it anymore. So I released it, and it is what it is. A Burning by Megha Majumdar. This hails from my Book of the Month days. And actually, The Vanishing Half was also something I got from Book of the Month Club. Because if you follow along, you know, I was a bad Book of the Month member because I felt like I had to get something every month. So I ended up not reading everything that I got. It was the biggest source of books that I unhauled without reading. So once I realized that, I canceled my membership. And they're also doing some kind of icky things about AI. You can Google it. We don't have to get into it here. So, A Burning. I was really interested in reading it at the time, and I admit my urgency is pretty well gone at this point. But every year when I do a book haul revisit, I kind of throw it out there. If you've read this book, let me know. And the comments are, supportive of me holding on to it until I get around to reading it. So I keep holding on to it, but I admit I just don't feel any sense of urgency to get around to reading this book. So at some point, I either need to force myself to dive into the book and see if I can get through it, or I just need to let it go and unhaul it. And the time for that decision is not now, but it will come at some point in the future. So, but if you've read it, let me know in the comment section down below. So there were 6 books that I brought into my library in June of 2020, and there's a trend emerging here. I've read 3. That's 50%. Again, that's math I can do. I've unhauled 1, and that is 17% of this book haul. And I had read that book when I unhauled it, so I have not unhauled any books without reading. But I had listened to that book on audio, so we're again at a 17% books that I listened to on audio instead of reading in print. That takes us to the final book haul that we need to cover for this revisit. These are books that I brought into my library in June of 2019. The first is The Stonewall Reader. I did read this. It was my very first ever buddy read because 2019 was my first year on BookTube, and I really enjoyed this book. Another great recommendation for Pride Month if you're looking for something. But yes, I read this one and am very happy to keep holding on to it. Given how excited I was to read You Will Be Here by Damian Barr in 2019, it is pretty shocking to me that I haven't gotten around to reading it. And occasionally I will see it on my shelf and think, I really want to read that. So I feel very fine holding on to this book until I eventually get to it, because there is still a sense of urgency to get to this book. We'll just see when I eventually get to it. Then we have On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. I have read this book. I remember being just a little bit mixed about it, but I actually would like to get a copy of his new book, The Emperor of Gladness. And that's neither here nor there, because we're really just trying to see whether or not I've read this book, and I have. And clearly I have held on to it, and I don't have any plans to let it go at this point. So, Ask Again Yes by Mary Beth Keane would have been the next book, but I unhauled it. I did read it. I ended up listening to it on audio, I believe, and I really liked it. But over time, it's in a part of the alphabet on these shelves behind me where there's usually not very much space. So I kind of thought about it and decided, I don't know how likely I am to reread this book. And I did it on audio the first time, so I let it go. But I did read it before it went. Then we have Circe by Madeline Miller, which you can see I got from Book of the Month. Have not read it. I ended up reading The Song of Achilles first, and I wasn't as big of a fan of that book as many other people are. Especially when I do a book haul revisit, people tell me Circe is better. You have to get to Circe. So at some point I will. I just admit that since I didn't like The Song of Achilles very much, there isn't a lot of urgency for me to get to Circe. I'm also not a huge fan of Greek myth retellings. Maybe that's because I don't know a whole lot about Greek mythology. But I do find it interesting. I just don't have a base of knowledge. So retellings, it just doesn't spark my interest in the way that it might if I was more familiar with Greek mythology. All of which is to say, I haven't read it. I don't know when I would get around to it, but I feel like I can't get rid of it until I do read it because I've gotten so many recommendations for this book. So we'll see when I get around to reading it. The next book was Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. I almost took that out because I remember I got the mass market of it and it was on sale. So I spent like $3 on it. It was an impulse purchase because it was on sale. But fact of the matter is I bought it. I haven't read it, and I unhauled it. So there you go. That is the case with that book. Next, we have A Complicated Kindness by Miriam Taves. I got this from my library for $2. Have not read it, but I would be curious to get around to reading more of Miriam Taves' backlist. I love All My Puny Sorrows. I love Women Talking. Wasn't a huge fan of Fight Night, but I would like to go back and read some of her earlier books at some point, and this is one of them. So it will be going nowhere. The final book in this entire book haul revisit is A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. Now, I did not count this as a book that I've read. I did start the audio of it toward the end of 2024, but I was going through it slowly. I was enjoying the audio so much that it took me too long. So I lost my hold of it on Libby. So now I need to decide if I want to get myself a copy of the audio so I don't have to worry about that time frame for borrowing or if I want to read the book because the language was beautiful. Ultimately, I counted this as something I have not read since, kind of similar to The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. I might end up reading the physical book, and at this point I would start at the beginning and go through again. So I do want to read this book hopefully soon even, because I did start the audio and was really enjoying it. I just need to finish it. So didn't count it as something that I have read because I want to finish the whole thing. All right, of the 8 books I brought into my library in June of 2019, I have read 3. And according to Google, that is 38%. I have unhauled 2 of those books, which is 25%, but only one of them was without reading, which is 13%. I have listened to 2 of those books on audio, which again is 25%, because I listened to On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous on audio. And as I said, I listened to Ask Again Yes on audio. All right, let's look at my numbers overall and see how I have done with all of my June book hauls. In the last 6 Junes, I have brought 30 books into my library that qualify for our purposes here, at least. And I have read 12 of them. That's actually a lot better than I thought I was doing when I started putting these numbers together. I thought that this was not going to go well. But it's 40%. That's not the 50% I am sort of aiming for, but it's working its way up there. So I'm not going to complain about it. I have unhauled 6 of those 30 books, which is 20% overall. And I have unhauled 3 books without reading them at all. And that's my watch out criteria. And again, I would like that number to be below 15%. It's at 10%, which is creeping up there. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens when I revisit June again next year, because we'll have a new batch of books coming in that I haul in June of this year. And maybe I will have read some of these books that I have piled next to me on the floor. Maybe I will have let some of the ones I haven't read and feel iffy about go. It will be interesting to see if it stays at 10% or if I do start creeping into the danger zone. I haven't hit the danger zone yet, but again, that's an arbitrary number that I decided to keep it below. And overall, I listened to 3 of the books on audio, which is 10%, as we just covered with the unhaul without reading. So that is how I've done in the last 6 book hauls from the month of June. I would love to hear if you have recommendations for me based on my interest in any of these books. If you would like to make a case for why I should get to one of these books or why I should keep one of these books, let me know in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.